Welcome to the 7th video on my research fieldwork around the English Channel for my PhD, which is looking into the maritime knowledge behind the Norman invasion of England in 1066. Today I'm going to talk to you about Saint-Valery-sur-Somme. I spent a day there after the last video shows us getting into that quite difficult harbour. It's very shallow indeed. And some of the pictures you'll see in this video will really highlight just how big it is, but also how shallow it is, and when it's low water in particular, how much of that land turns into tidal salt marsh, and of course sand. So these images show half tide in the channel up to the town of Saint-Valery-sur-Somme. So this is through the Baie de Somme, like I say, along the town. And the way the tides work, very basically, is that tides change every 6 hours. So you have a high tide followed by a low tide. Basically, high tides are 12 hours apart. So this is mid-tide, and there'll be some photographs shortly which will show low tide. The pictures yesterday when we were coming in, that was high tide. But the time of the month it is at the moment is called neaps, and I'm not going to confuse things too much by going into all that, but it basically means that the highs and the lows are closer together. The range is reduced, so the lows and the highs don't have as much difference between them. At different times of the month you have something called springs, and at those times the tides are very different. So they're the highest highs and the lowest lows, generally speaking, but not always. So I'll leave it at that because it is quite a complicated thing to try and explain, but this is mid-tide anyway. And as you can see, it's shallow enough across the river for people to be walking across it without any difficulty whatsoever. Where I live in the Severn estuary, the mid-tide is usually at least around 4 metres, so this is quite unusual for me to see, and it's very interesting, but it does mean that the tidal considerations are completely different here. Even though the tide looks significant when you look at these photographs between the mid-tide people walking across and the high tide we came in on in the same place, it's so shallow that it can misrepresent how deep it actually is. So in a time before modern navigational information, this is the sort of thing that local knowledge would have ensured safe passage. Because otherwise, if you've got a deep enough draft on your vessel, this is the view back towards the Baie de Somme. You can't even see the sea. I had my telescope lens and I still couldn't see the sea on my camera. So you could find yourself quite a long way from land if you've run aground, and you're there for quite a long time because of the tides. 6 hours between tides, and if you happen to run aground on a high tide, you'd have 12 hours to wait and hope you can get yourself free then. The reason that I came to Saint-Valery-sur-Somme is because all of the medieval sources we have for the Norman invasion of England agree that it was at Saint-Valery that William finally set sail from to arrive at Pevensey for the Norman invasion and the subsequent Battle of Hastings in the Pevensey area. William of Poitiers does mention the Dives estuary as the original place where the fleet collected, and Guy of Amiens, who was from this area originally, just inland from Saint-Valery, is the town of Abbeville, and he was related to the ducal family, the comital family there. So he had close connections to the people and the place. So his account does say that the Normans assembled at Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, and he says that they were blown there from elsewhere, but he doesn't specify Dives. I'm now going to read you the excerpt from the Carmen de Hastings Proilio, which is the Song of the Battle of Hastings, written by Guy of Amiens, that discusses William's time in the Somme estuary. But in the end, whether you liked it or not, you left your own shore and directed your ships towards the coast of a neighbour. The port of Vimy, which the river Somme enfolds, is said to have been known to the ancients. Its inhabitants, although well skilled in warfare, more often provide true hospitality to seafarers. Above the port stands the town of Saint-Valery. Here you had a long and troublesome delay, spending a fortnight in that territory waiting for succour from the supreme judge. You visited the saint's church often and devoutly, with sighs and prayers, making pure offerings to him. You looked to see by what wind the church's weathercock was turned. If it was from the south, you departed happily, but if on a sudden the north wind interrupted and held it at bay, tears streamed down your cheeks. You were forsaken. It was cold and wet, and the sky was hidden by clouds and rain. But Almighty God, on whom you rested your hopes, he who created, marks out and directs the seasons, who weighs the heavens, the earth, and the sea in the hollow of his just hand, who is always in all places, and who in his compassion gave Peter, in return for his prayers, a calm sea on which he could walk, that same gracious God at last took pity on you and your desires, and, in return for your vow, furnished you abundantly with the means. He drove the clouds from the sky and the winds from the sea. He dispelled the cold and cleansed the heavens of rain. The earth became warm, bathed in great heat, and the sun shone with unusual brilliance. The festival of St. Michael was about to be celebrated throughout the world when God granted you everything according to your desires. The church of Saint-Valery that Guy of Amiens was referring to in that text was the site from the 7th century of an oratory and then of a chapel up high on a hill. And it's just outside of the fortified part of the town, as it would have been in the 11th century. So it's not very far from where William would have been staying if he'd been staying in Saint-Valery-sur-Somme. So you can walk out there, and although the modern church is 19th century, it's in the same location, and the trees have grown up, so you don't have such a clear view of the estuary. But that church is the church that William is recorded, according to Guy, as having gone up to check what the wind was doing by looking at the weather vane that was on the church spire. Though the weather vane today is interesting in its own right because it's a seagull, which is quite an unusual bird to have on the top of these. They're normally roosters or things like that. In the 11th century, the weather vanes would have looked something like this. These 4 weather vanes all date from the late 11th or 12th centuries, 2 from Sweden, 2 from Norway, and originally they would have been on the prows of ships, but these have been converted to fit onto the steeples of churches, and there must have been something similar in the church, the church at Saint-Valery that William came to see. These 4 surviving examples of wind vanes are all 15th century conversions into to move from a boat onto a church, but there is likely to have been other earlier examples as well. These are just the ones that happen to survive. One of these weather vanes is particularly interesting. It's the Tingelstad weather vane from Norway, and as you can see, it's got Romanesque imagery, and it was recently in the Die Normannen exhibition in Mannheim that I went to see in January this year. It finished at the end of February this year. But this weather vane was either made by a Norman before the Norman conquest in Normandy, or it was made after the Norman conquest by somebody living in Normandy or England. So it's quite interesting. The dating, to the best of my knowledge, isn't very fixed. It's either late 11th century or 12th century. So I need to look into this a lot more, but it's very interesting that this is the sort of style potentially that might have been on the weather vane that William was looking at, and it's certainly an interesting thing to consider from the maritime knowledge required for sailing. The wind is fundamental, so I'm certainly going to be exploring weather vanes further in my research, and they're beautiful objects as well. So finally, because you can't help but be a bit obsessed by the tide when you're sailing around this area, this is Saint-Valery-sur-Somme at low tide. So we've seen throughout this video high tide, mid tide, and now low tide. So you can see just how dried out it becomes, and you can see the change there from low to high tide in the two pictures. While walking around St. Valery, you can't help but notice just how aware they are of their historic link to the Norman invasion. There's images, texts on signs, and quite a lot of sculptural elements regarding the fact that William is recorded as having left from Saint-Valery-sur-Somme for the invasion of England and the subsequent Norman conquest. And here's just a few examples of the things I saw while walking around. I hope you've enjoyed this video about Saint-Valery-sur-Somme. The next video will be on the crossing from Saint-Valery to Pevensey Bay, which is the same journey undertaken by the Norman invasion fleet in 1066. We'll be crossing in the daytime though, whereas the sources say they crossed overnight. And the sources also say that William anchored in the middle of the channel for a hearty breakfast, but I certainly won't be doing that either. Because, well, for many reasons, but not least that there is a traffic separation scheme in place in the English Channel in this area where we're crossing, where absolutely enormous ships have to travel up and down the English Channel in a particular direction, so it's just like a motorway, and sailing boats have to go at a 90-degree angle to this traffic separation scheme, as it's called. So nobody would be very happy with us if we decided to just stop in the middle. It would also be exceptionally dangerous. But we will be making that crossing in the daytime. I will be doing another video about it when I get a chance. But that is the conclusion of the French side of the research fieldwork that I've been undertaking. It's been really, really informative. There's way more than I can possibly fit into these videos, and it's going to take me a long time to sort of process it all as well. And I've got so many things that I want to go away and really look into in so much more detail, but it's been really useful. I hope you found it interesting, and I will be doing videos for the other side as well, so from Pevensey, for example. So thank you very much for your interest, and I'll do at least one more video. The final leg of the journey is just getting back home, basically, so it's probably less relevant to the Norman invasion, but the next video will be the crossing. The one after that will be Pevensey Bay. So there's two more to come. Thank you very much.